Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's session from Pact to Progress, Open Science, Open Innovation, and Digital Cooperation, an official side event to the High-Level Political Forum. I'm Meg Swacha, and I serve as the Scholarly Communications Officer at the UN Dag Hammarskjöld Library of the Department of Global Communications. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Dag Hammarskjöld Library's website as well as its YouTube channel. It is also governed by the UN Code of Conduct, and by joining this event, you agree to abide by this code. Today's session will be offered in English. We apologize that the platform does not provide automatic translation, and we invite you to turn on captions. We have reserved time for a discussion at the end of the session, so please add your questions into the chat as they come up. My colleagues and I are watching that space, and we will collect your questions for the end. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Mr. Robert Skinner. Rob is the Deputy Director and Chief of Partnerships and Global Engagement in the Outreach Division of the UN Department of Global Communications. Prior to this role, he served as the Director of the United Nations Information Center in Washington, D.C., and the Senior Special Advisor in the Department of Global Communications, focused on the UN's COVID-19 Communications Response Initiative. He was also the Executive Director of the United Nations Office for Partnerships. Before joining the UN, Robert was the Executive Director in the New York office of the United Nations Foundation. He has held several positions in the United States Department of State, including as Deputy Spokesperson at the United States Mission to the UN in New York.
Thank you very much, Megs, and thanks to Thanos and all the team at the Dag Hammarskjöld Library for putting this together, and all the work you're doing on open science, a critical issue for all of us here today, of course, but just generally a critical issue for the world. So distinguished delegates, colleagues, and participants, thanks to all of you for joining us online. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I've been seeing the names and locations pop up on my screen, and we know that people are literally joining from all over the world. So thank you for being with us right now. It's my honor to welcome you to this important discussion on open science, digital cooperation, and the Pact for the future as we work collectively towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think if anyone saw the Secretary General press conference yesterday on the 2025 SDG report, you'll know that we're quite off track, which is why science and open science is absolutely critical as we try and move forward and achieve progress on the SDGs. We have a long way to go before 2030, and we have a long way to go to making the progress we need to make on the SDGs. But back to the Pact for the Future and its annexes, they were adopted by world leaders in September 2024, as many of you know, culminating a years-long process to adapt international cooperation to address shared challenges. The Pact recommits us to accelerate the 2030 agenda and recognizes that advances in knowledge, science, technology, and innovation could deliver a breakthrough to a better and more sustainable future for all. Chapter 3 of the Pact focuses on science, technology, and innovation, advancing an open, fair, and inclusive environment for scientific cooperation worldwide. And guided by equity and solidarity, it leverages science to promote human rights. The Declaration on Future Generations, one of the annexes, states ensuring inclusive and equitable access to knowledge, science, and information while promoting innovation, critical thinking, and life skills to create generations of citizens that are agents of positive change and transformation. This aligns with open science, which ensures equal opportunity to access, contributes to, and benefit from science regardless of origin or circumstance. Open science presents an opportunity to bridge the growing divide within and between developed and developing countries, and as the Global Digital Compact states, to support the development of local content and content relevant to local realities, and that's absolutely critical. Open science, including open data, open source software, open standards, and open content, is a digital public good that has proven its potential to empower societies and individuals. Through strengthened international cooperation, open science promises to accelerate the achievement of the SDGs. On July 17th, the President of the General Assembly will convene the third informal interactive dialogue to support the implementation of the Pact for the Future. These dialogues serve as a platform for member states to exchange views and share best practices. The Pact also requires cooperation across governments, private sector, civil society, and scientific communities, very inclusive, and much like the goals themselves were as they were created and as they continue to, as we all continue to work for their achievement. So previous dialogues from the PGA have reinforced that a whole of society approach is essential to delivering on this transformative agenda. So again, thanks to all of you for being with us today and participating in this open conversation. We have an amazing group of panelists that are going to make presentations to us all before we open the floor to Q&A. And as Meg's indicated, please put your questions, comments in the chat, and we will do our best to get to them. But working with our presenters, distinguished presenters today, we'll try and make sure everything gets answered in this community, which you really believe in this community of scientists and diplomats are critical to this dialogue. So I will introduce each of the panelists just prior to their intervention. So first, I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Joyeeta Gupta to join us. Dr. Gupta is a professor of environment and development in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam and professor at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. Previously, she was professor on climate change policy and law at Vrije University in Amsterdam. She is a recipient of multiple prestigious awards. It's a really quite a list, Dr. Gupta, including the Spinoza Prize and the Amsterdam Impact Prize. She was the lead author in the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 1998 to 2014, which won the Nobel Peace Prize with Al Gore in 2007, and the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which won the Zayed Second Prize. Dr. Gupta currently serves as co-chair of the Secretary General appointed United Nations group of 10 high-level representatives of civil society, private sector, and scientific community to promote science, technology, and innovation for the SDGs. Dr. Gupta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. While my slides are coming up, I'm going to just make two introductory statements. And the first statement is that no matter how much critique there may be of the Pact of the Future, I think that multilateralism is absolutely essential for the way we move forward, whether it is with science, technology, innovation, or it's peacemaking or any other issue. So I would first like to say that I have a full-fledged support for the Pact of the Future. Having said that, my second comment is that I have been doing research and teaching for the last 35 years. And in that period, I have actually seen an improvement in open access, in fair and equitable science, but suddenly that seems to have evaporated in the last 4, 5, 6 years. And what we are seeing is a shrinking scientific space. And so it is from the context of both admiration and the reality that I make a presentation of the policy and the reality and the challenges to fair, open, free, and equitable science, and I'll take examples from climate change. Essentially, what I want to talk about is that in the slides, in the Pact of the Future, there are a number of articles that focus on science, technology, and innovation. One of them talks about promoting an open, fair, and inclusive environment and ensuring that we build trust in science. And another key element is to make science-based policy. But what I'm seeing in the course of my research, at least, is that in relation to climate change and especially fossil fuel, so the phase down or phase out of fossil fuel, we notice that there is a shrinking space to talk about it, to interview people, and to do research on this topic. In fact, all sciences that focus on risk and social sciences that question the way society is organized are sort of threatened currently. And in this process, we also find that politicians contribute to questioning trust in science, because across the spectrum of politicians, there are politicians that do not believe in modern science. And when you talk about the social science component, as sociologist Louis Wirth said, since the problems with the social scientists deals are characteristically controversial issues among the rival groups comprising society, social science runs the risk of being considered dangerous thought, and the social scientist a subversive character. And so what you find is a combination of environmental science, social science, and to some extent also health science is being ignored in terms of other issues, sometimes in favor of short-term economic growth, and that is often supported by the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And we as scientists, we don't have the mechanisms to spread information quite like that. The World Economic Forum made a slide some years ago where they showed that the short-term perspective looks at economic growth in the short term, but doesn't look at how this growth will be affected by environmental problems or social problems in the medium to long term. And this is something that we have to contrast. So I really value the fact that the Pact of the Future comes back and says we really need to focus on science-based policy and open, fair, and inclusive environment. In my next slide, I focus more on the idea of sustainable growth. So when we are looking at the next paragraph, it focuses on scaling up information with the perspective of trying to involve developing countries and engage them more effectively in the process. And I just picked out 3 of the elements. The science is supposed to promote sustainable growth and climate action. Science is supposed to eradicate poverty and reduce inequality, including caused by the climate impacts. And so basically, we need science that does that. And science is supposed to help support developing countries in working on science, but especially in terms of financing and private sector mobilization of money. The reality at this moment is that more and more people are realizing that the actual cause of climate change or biodiversity loss or desertification, air pollution is essentially our existing growth model. So any effort to maintain the current growth model is perhaps contradictory to taking climate action. And even our Secretary General made a speech a few years ago where he outlined that the GDP concept is perhaps out of date. So that is a little bit of a challenge in the Pact of the Future. Another thing is we talk about eradicating poverty and reducing inequality, leaving no one behind. But if you look at the current situation, we are already at 1.2 and probably going to cross 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2030. But already at 1 degree centigrade, at least 70 million people were exposed to deadly wet bulb temperatures. So we're talking really at 1 degree centigrade, about 1% of the global population being exposed to death or significant harm or displacement. How are we actually using climate science, therefore, to eradicate poverty from the impact side? And so that requires us to think much more about the justice components in our work. Moreover, science on poverty and inequality tend to get marginal funding. And of course, we see everywhere that public funds, especially for development cooperation, are decreasing dramatically, while the demand for funds are increasing. And I believe the funding gap is somewhere near $4 trillion, as was mentioned in the Financing for Development conference a few weeks ago. So if you have so much money needed, how are we going to finance it? And my fear is if you get the private sector involved, the chances are that the private sector will focus on improving their profits, especially for their shareholders. And so this brings me to my next slide, which is on human rights, because there you see that the goal is that science should promote human rights. Human rights should be integrated in how we govern technology as well as how we govern the private sector. And there should be meaningful participation of all in this process. And we need to use technologies to also empower people with disabilities. I think the last one is a really good idea, especially if you can implement it. And I'm going to focus on the first 3. What you see is that environmental problems are causing today 25% of all death and morbidity. Zoonotic disease is responsible for at least 60% of all infectious disease. So essentially, a disease means a breakdown of your right to human rights. So the question is, how are we using our knowledge systems to ensure that health and environmental issues are protected in such a way that we protect the human rights of everybody, and not just of those that are super rich, not just of those who are shareholders in the private sector. And of course, if you look at the private sector companies, they really need to protect their shareholders. And so even if the shareholders look at human rights, the bottom line is the economic narrative. So the question is, how do we create a better narrative around the private sector governance, which incorporates this human rights narrative? Because otherwise, if we do not operationalize this, it will just remain a rhetorical commitment. And if you look at other types of science like artificial intelligence, I would argue that it tends to, in its large language models, reproduce dominant science. So because social science has been relatively less covered, less quantitative, AI is less able to reproduce it. And so you might end up with enlarging information from some sectors at the cost of other sectors. And I don't believe that human rights approaches have been programmed into the way the AI machine thinks about the knowledge that comes up. One of the articles also talks about participation. And in fact, the participation story is across most of these ideas that have been promoted currently in open science. And I truly believe that open science will help because you get a joint problem definition, you can co-produce knowledge, you can publish open access papers and make your data available to people. And there are a number of principles being developed by various organizations to promote this. Having said that, I also am aware that knowledge and ideas are being misused. I once wrote a paper, I wrote a lot of papers on justice, I've written papers on IPC scenarios, and suddenly I find that AI has created a paper written by me on justice in scenarios. And I find that it's not a full paper, it's an abstract. And I'm wondering, how did this happen? Did my knowledge really get used? Did my ideas get misused? But that's not the only place. A lot of this open science storyline is collecting information from different areas and trying to use it. But this knowledge is often taken for free by AI. And then the AI company sells it because you need a subscription before you can get the access to the good quality AI products. And that is also true for when the private sector downloads open knowledge and markets it in an commercial AI. The other thing is that right now I'm working on a number of issues, and the question is, if I was working on leaving fossil fuel underground because I want to protect human rights and I want to make sure that we stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a certain level, and then I invite the general public to come in to discuss their views, I might get completely overwhelmed by climate skeptics who just give their opinions rather than scientific information. So how do we decipher what is an opinion and what is science? And then if you're all sitting together and co-producing knowledge, could there be a risk of dilution? And things like that. And moreover, publishers charge exorbitant prices for open access publications, and that is quite a risk in many areas. So moving to my more or less last slide, I would like to explain that if you look at the climate change problem or any of these big problems, it's huge. And the people who are trying to make policies barely understand a small part of the problem. And so the question is, when we are trying to summarize the science for them, are we able to do this? And do we all get a chance to communicate this? And how do we organize that better? And with that, I just want to thank the sponsors that have sponsored my research so far. That's the next slide. That's the Earth Commission, the Spinoza Grant, and the CLIF project financed by the European Research Council Advanced Grant. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. I think it's really important that we look at not just the opportunities of the open science, but the challenges we're facing, and you really identified those. And thank you so much for your support of multilateralism and the Pact that you expressed at the opening of your remarks. I think folks watching the UN know we need a lot of support at the moment, so it's very much appreciated. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Matthew Wong to provide his presentation. Mr. Wong is First Secretary of Cybersecurity and Digital Cooperation at the Permanent Mission of Singapore to the United Nations. Mr. Wong has represented Singapore at the United Nations since 2021 on issues at the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and international diplomacy, including serving as lead advisor to the chair of the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Cybersecurity, Ambassador Burhan Ghafoor of Singapore, and as Singapore's head of delegation for intergovernmental negotiations on the Global Digital Compact. Mr. Wong previously served in the Southeast Asia Directorate at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore with responsibility for bilateral relations with Indonesia. Prior to that, he served in the Singapore Armed Forces, where he led a software engineering team. Impressive background, Matthew, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert. And distinguished delegates, fellow colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings from the Permanent Mission of Singapore in New York. And thank you also to Thanos, Ariel, Max, and everyone else from the Dax-Hammarskjöld Library for putting this panel together. It is a great honor to be speaking on such a distinguished panel on this very, very important topic. And I'm very much looking forward today to sharing some thoughts on Singapore's approach to open science, open innovation, and digital cooperation. And first of all, I want to say that I think it's very important that we are continuing this conversation on the Pact of the Future. Those of you who are in New York will know that Singapore was a very strong supporter of the Pact of the Future, both in our national capacity as well as the convener of the Small States Group. And, while the adoption of the Pact was a historic achievement, I think it's very clear from the conversation that's going on at the UN now that our responsibility is to ensure that its implementation is moving ahead and that we actually deliver on those commitments and promises that we've all agreed to and all set out in the Pact of the Future. So the first thing I want to say on open science and open innovation is that for Singapore, this is part of a much broader strategy and much broader approach to participation in the world and to policy making. And by that, I mean that Singapore is a very strong and very firm believer in the idea and the concept of an open world. And that's simply because an open, interconnected world is so critical, so existentially critical for small states like Singapore and for so many other small states around the world. And this is true in science and technology, definitely, but it's also true in so many other domains. For example, free trade. Singapore is hugely reliant on an open, inclusive, and rules-based international trading system, the free movement of capital, and interoperable cyberspace. And finally, of course, since we're here at the United Nations, an open and inclusive multilateral system where every state has a voice and every country, no matter how small or large, has the opportunity to shape our collective future. And in this regard, in Singapore, we are firm believers in the idea that the world is a better place when all of us work together in an open, interconnected way, and that together we can achieve more than we would be able to do alone. It's this fundamental principle that guides all policy making in Singapore, and it's also the principle that guides our approach to open science, open innovation, and digital cooperation. So now that I've set out that broad context, I want to share 3 broad ideas that underpin the way that we do open science and open innovation in Singapore. So the first idea is that open science and open innovation starts at home. As we've heard this morning and in so many other discussions on the Pact of the Future, implementation is key. And it's now the responsibility of every government that's in a position to do so to exercise leadership in our implementation of these commitments that we've made. At the same time, governments cannot do this alone. We need to work very closely with all stakeholders, including academia, the private sector, and civil society to make sure that this implementation actually happens. So on open science in Singapore, the government, in partnership with stakeholders, with our universities, with scientists across the country, with civil society, we've been engaged in a long-running effort for many, many years to promote this idea of open science. In 2013, our Agency for Science, Technology and Research, you may know, introduced an open access mandate for all publicly funded research. This was quickly followed by mandates from other national funders, including our National Research Foundation and our National Medical Research Council. Of course, open access is only the first step. In 2024, we took the next step forward by also introducing a push towards open data. So the National Medical Research Council introduced the framework for research data governance and sharing, and it required funded projects to share final research data for any projects that were seeking funding of more than $250,000. On the open data side of it, the government is also directly doing its part. In 2021, the Singapore government launched data.gov.sg, which is Singapore's open government data portal, where all government agencies can share and are in fact encouraged to share the data that they have in a way that's completely free for personal and commercial use. there are now more than 4,000 data sets on data.gov.sg provided by close to 70 government agencies. And what we've seen is that this approach works. When you put the data out there, people come and people use it. There's a very real demand for such data. Data.gov.sg gets about 350,000 monthly visitors. We have developers sending about 13 million API calls to our service every month. So it shows that if you put these resources out there, people will come and people will build things, and together this is how you encourage stakeholders, and you galvanize the whole country to make use of these of what we have, and to build a better world. The second broad idea that guides our approach to open science and open innovation is to actively share what we've built, and also to actively share what we've learned with others. And this is where the ideas of things like open source plays a key role. We have a dedicated group in the Singapore government. They're called Open Government Products. They are housed within our technology agency, GovTech, and their job, their mandate is to develop open source technology for public good. Their products are open source. They're freely available for international partners to build upon. They range from very basic services that every government agency will need. For example, one of their first products was a product called FormSG, which is basically like what you have in Google Forms, but something that you can run from government in a trusted way and a secure way. And now they were a very instrumental part of the COVID-19 response, for example, putting out apps for people to figure out where do they get their vaccinations, how do they get healthcare supplies, and so on. So they build all of these products, they build them open source, and right now we also have an effort to share these products with international partners, with our partners in ASEAN, for example, so that they can take these products, build on them, customize them to their own needs without having to start from scratch. Because around the world, we're all facing the same challenges. We all need the same resources. So we all work together, we get there faster. It's the same thing with other government agencies across the government. There's been a push to encourage agencies to open source what they are building. So in 2022, the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore launched a product called AI Verify, which is an AI governance testing framework to help companies and organizations assess whether their AI systems are being implemented responsibly against internationally recognized AI governance principles. So after we developed AI Verify, we subsequently open sourced it, and we also set up what we call the AI Verify Foundation, which now works together with partners in the private sector and civil society to guide that further development of AI Verify. And it's also important to go beyond just sharing what we've built to also sharing what we've learned. So those of you who are at the UN in New York will know that Singapore has been the convener of the Forum of Small States for the past 30 years. And in that capacity, in 2024, Singapore launched the AI Playbook for Small States, which we developed in consultations with and through contributions from fellow members of the Forum of Small States. And this playbook is essentially a set of best practices that we got from a range of small states on how they are implementing AI strategies and policies in their countries to drive innovation and drive science in a very open, collaborative way. So, we believe it's very important that not only we share what we build, but also we share our experiences so that we can build on each other's success and accelerate our progress towards the implementation of everything that we've agreed here at the UN. And so that then brings me to the third broad idea, is that once we're implementing at home, once we're sharing what we're doing, the third broad idea is to work together with international partners and the international system to advocate for key principles of openness to be built into the international system. So of course, the Pact of the Future is one such example. The very reason we're having this panel discussion today is because the principles of open science, open innovation, digital cooperation, they've been enshrined into the Pact and into the Global Digital Compact. And Singapore is a very strong advocate for this. We were also a very strong advocate for the principle of interoperability to be enshrined into the Global Digital Compact. And as global discussions at the UN and across the UN system, other multilateral fora on topics like AI, data governance, digital cooperation continue to gather momentum, there will be more and more opportunities to advocate for these principles. And as believers in an open world, this is what we and other international partners need to do. So I hope this has provided an insight into the approach that we take as Singapore, and the approach that a small state takes towards these issues. And I look forward to hearing from many of our other distinguished panelists, and happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I mean, I think it's really important, the insights you provided on the importance of implementation. I mean, we can all get the words on paper at the UN, but the implementation is absolutely critical, and having this multi-sectoral approach is critical to getting that implementation to take place. And also, thanks to Singapore's work for convening the small states, and working together, because I think, when the small states combine their voices and work together, the impact is so much greater, and Singapore has really been leading in that space. So thanks to you and your colleagues at the mission for taking that on. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ms. María Estelí Jarquín. Ms. Jarquín works at the intersection of science and diplomacy, and is currently the International Relations Manager at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. She was recently elected as the youngest ever member of the governing board of the International Science Council, where she is also co-chairing a report on science diplomacy. Ms. Jarquín served as an expert in the European Union Science Diplomacy Working Groups, and previously was the Deputy Director of International Affairs at the University of Costa Rica, leading its global strategy. She has also consulted for various UN agencies, and founded and chairs the Costa Rican chapter of UNESCO's Organization for Women in Science from the Developing World. Ms. Jarquín, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm gonna share my slides, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and also want to thank my colleagues at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and the International Science Council for contributing to my presentation. Just a picture to reflect on a side event that we organized in September last year, together with the Department of Global Communications and with the presence of Undersecretary General Melissa Fleming, where we celebrated, and we were a bit witness of the birth of the Pact for the Future, which we are discussing today, and which, as my previous panelist said, I'm very supportive of it. And let me also say that the International Science Council published a paper about the importance of considering science as a global public good that should be freely available and accessible worldwide. And I invite all of you to check the report that is available in 7 languages in the ISC website. For this session, I was asked to discuss on the actionable recommendations, or at least to provide inputs for actionable recommendations for the implementation of the Pact for the Future actions, especially the science and technology ones, which are actions 28 to 33, and that interesting intersection between new and emerging technologies, and what are the opportunities that lie for equitable and inclusive knowledge system. Now, an anecdote that I wanted to share is that last year I was in front of this very beautiful exhibition in the United Nations headquarters, looking at this concert of nations that we are when we come together in multilateralism, which I'm very supportive of as well. And I couldn't help but wonder, well, I am a person that was born, raised, educated in a so-called developing country. And now I am based, I work, I live in what is called or considered a developed country. And I feel that this binary vision of the world and the way countries should be grouped has defined my career, has defined the role I would like to play in scientific institutions, in science and in science diplomacy. So when reading the Pact for the Future and realizing that these terms are present in every page, I think that this is perhaps the first recommendation that I would like to raise as a thought-provoking for the later discussion, and it's the fact that I think we're facing various challenges when using those two terms. First, we cannot imagine a future for humanity. We cannot build a future for science and open science when our language reinforces hierarchies and inequalities. Let's look at this. The word developed is actually against everything that's is at the heart of science, because developed implies that nations already reach a final destination. It's the end of progress. So it ignores ongoing challenges, but also the fact that actually scientific endeavors never finish. It's a continuous evolvement. And finally, those two labels, developed and developing nations, also ignore complex and diverse realities. When countries actually have unique strengths and challenges to face. And when we work in science, we very quickly realize that the local expertise around particular environments and ecosystems is rather essential. So my first key message for this discussion is that it's time our language embodies true equity. Let's move beyond the developed and developing divide. Now, I would like to analyze 3 particular actions that are included in the Pact for the Future. I will start with Action 28, but we'll focus on Item C, which encourages talent mobility and support developing countries to retain talent and prevent a brain drain. And I think the challenge here is that retaining all talent within national borders is no longer realistic and actually not desirable in science. Science thrives when there's international circulations of brains and mobility. And actually, we believe that emergent technologies can help us transform brain drain into brain circulation to foster long-term partnerships. And I would like to bring your attention to the role that scientific diasporas can play. So scientific diasporas are scientists that are based in scientific institutions away from their home countries. So imagine all the potential that they could play in engaging with their home countries in cloud-based data sharing, in remote teaching tools, in general, in virtual research collaboration platforms. So I guess my key message number 2 is that scientific diasporas are key for the Pact for the Future, and that emerging technologies can turn distance into proximity. The next action that I would like to analyze is Action 29, in Item C, which supports the development, deployment, and sustainable use of emerging and open source technologies. Having worked in different settings of scientific institutions, higher education institutions as well, I have learned that open science cannot be embedded overnight in scientific institutions. It requires sustained engagement and exposure to the concepts, to what are the best data sharing practices, and what are the best tools to adapt to the very rapid development of technologies that we are looking at. So I wanted to bring your attention the Robin, which is a worldwide initiative led by the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which actually is building an open, high-quality data set of stream flow records from natural and near-natural catchment, engaging over 40 countries and key partners such as WMO and UNESCO to foster reproducible hydrological analysis and share authorship. At the same time that it responds to 2 critical SDGs as number 6 and 13. I invite everyone interested in hydrology to join the Robin Network wherever in the world you are, because I believe that actually this network initiative made me understand my key message number 3, which is the importance of funding, sustaining network initiatives such as Robin and many others that can actually act as springboards to support institutions as they integrate rapid technological advancement and open science into their systems and workflows. Because let's remember, it doesn't happen overnight, and that support needs to be continuous. And what better to do it with your friends at the scientific level. The final action that I would like to analyze is Action 30, Action 30, Item C, which is seeking to ensure that those in vulnerable situations benefit from and fully and meaningfully participate in the development and application of science, technology, and innovation. So having worked in scientific institutions in Latin America, I understood that researchers in middle and low-income countries often face a triple barrier when engaging in the development of science. So there's one barrier that everyone talks about, physical barrier. We now know that there is limited institutional funding to cover publication fees, to attend key events, for example, COPs or any other intergovernmental event or conferences, or even to access and use state-of-the-art research. But less people talk about other two critical barriers that are language barrier. So using a non-native language can hinder engagement. It's already difficult to speak in a language that is not yours. Now imagine doing science in a language that is not yours. Imagine publishing, imagine joining networks, imagine doing networking in a language that is not yours. And what about the emotional barrier rooted in the persistent stigma of being a developing country, which can lead to this sense of exclusion from the global scientific community? Am I good enough to publish this paper? Am I worthy to sit in this table today in this side event at the UN? So this triple barrier is essential to recognize, to talk about it, to make questions, to reflect no matter where in the world you are based. And I would like to bring this initiative from the International Science Council. It's a forum on publishing and research assessment, connecting reform for a more open and equitable research system. So we all agree that publication, the model needs to change. So what this is doing is that it's integrating initiatives to allow a more equitable publishing models where diverse scientific voices are actually recognized. So it's building a community of communities to align existing initiatives like DORA, COARA, the Barcelona Declaration, FOLEC, CLACSO, and UNESCO Open Science Recommendation, bring them together to amplify and align those global efforts. This brings me to my last key message, and is the fact that we need to adopt an integrated approach that addresses the full range of barriers that vulnerable populations face when engaging with science, technology, innovation, especially in the context of emerging technologies. And these are my 4 key messages that I wanted to bring with you. I'm very happy to reflect further in the Q&A and to, of course, take any questions so far. Please reach out. This is my email, and find out more about UKCH and the ISC in our websites. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thanks for the thoughtful comments. I particularly, as the library DHL sits in the Department of Global Communications, we think about language a lot, and making sure that we're speaking a language that people understand, particularly when we're talking about sometimes complicated issues, like the Sustainable Development Goals and, like the Pact for the Future, and making sure that people can, access them in a language that's understandable. I think that's absolutely critical. And I love your term brain circulation. I confess I had not heard that one before, but I love that. So yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Declan Kirrane. Mr. Kirrane is the founder and managing director of ISC Intelligence and Science in Brussels. He has more than 25 years of experience disseminating scientific and research activities in Europe and worldwide from organizations and governments. He was the launch editor of Cordis, the European Commission's Research Information Service. His expertise covers ICT, health, defense, space, science policy, GPRD legislation, EU R&D and innovation policies, programs, and funding instruments. He has worked extensively on science policy, evaluation methodologies, and technology options for policy and decision makers' use of investment in science. He is also closely involved in EU-Africa science and innovation relations and investments. Mr. Kirrane, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robert. Delighted to be here. A very, very important occasion. I think this juncture and the theme today, from Pact to Progress, open science, open innovation, and digital cooperation, hugely important as we meet during the high-level political forum. And of course, this gives us pause to reflect on the priorities for the United Nations General Assembly later this year. Excellence, these colleagues and friends, great to be here. The title of today's event, From Pact to Progress, captures the moment we are in. The Pact for the Future gives us the principles. Now we must translate them into systems that are participatory, open, and fair. Central to this is the universal right to participate in and benefit from science, a right that remains out of reach for many people, particularly in the global south, or as we now know it, the global majority. This exclusion is not accidental. It is baked into infrastructure, governance, funding models, and most critically, data systems. And we must be clear, women and girls are among the most severely impacted, facing compounded barriers in access to education, research communities, and digital resources. If we do not address these systemic imbalances, the future of science will be as exclusive as its past. The Pact calls on us to build a more inclusive scientific and technological ecosystem. Open science is a powerful enabler of that goal. It is intended to democratize knowledge creation, demands transparency, and promotes collaboration across borders. But just as we advance open science in principle, we are seeing new and serious constraints in practice. Take, for example, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and the more recent EU AI Act. These are just two examples of many developed world regulations that are designed to apply globally. These frameworks are important. They protect privacy and ethical guidelines, and I think we can all agree on this, but their extraterritorial impact and application can also restrict data sharing for scientific research, particularly for institutions outside the EU, and lack the legal, financial, and technical capacity to comply. In effect, we are potentially creating a regulatory perimeter around scientific collaboration. When researchers in Nairobi and Dhaka are unable to access climate data or train AI models because of legal uncertainty or high compliance costs, we are not protecting rights, we are reinforcing inequality. This is what many now describe as data imperialism, or the recolonization of science, where data is harvested globally but governed narrowly, where algorithmic power is centralized and global knowledge production is filtered through essentially northern legal and commercial frameworks and regimes. At the Science Summit, which I convene each year to coincide with the United Nations General Assembly, we have seen both the promise of open science and the barriers that are threatened to undermine it. Three key lessons stand out. We must treat data as a global public good. That means building interoperable systems that are legally inclusive and ethically robust, with data stewardship rooted in regional institutions and local communities, not just centralized in the north. Secondly, digital cooperation must serve equity, not exclusion. AI can democratize access to knowledge, but only if we democratize access to AI. That means open source models, equitable compute infrastructures, and research partnerships that include and empower women, early career scientists, and historically marginalized groups. Thirdly, participation is non-negotiable. Indigenous knowledge systems, citizen science, and gender-responsive research are not optional extras. They must be embedded in the architecture of science and science policy and the alignment of science policy globally. So in my view, to deliver on actions 28 to 33 of the Pact, we need to do more than promote openness. We need to remove the structural and regulatory barriers that block collaboration and equity. Much more enabling policy and regulatory environment is urgently needed. For discussion purposes, I am setting forward three recommendations. First, develop a global framework for open scientific data governance, co-led by the UN, that reconciles the right to privacy with the imperative of access. This must include safeguards to ensure that regulations like the GDPR and the AI Act do not become de facto barriers to scientific progress. especially for institutions in the global south. Second, establish regional centers for data and AI stewardship, particularly in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. These hubs can interpret and adapt global regulations in ways that protect rights, where also they can enable inclusive innovation. And I know these issues were visited in the United Nations AI report last year, Governing for Humanity, which was announced at the Science Summit last year on the 18th of September. And I am, and many others, I mean, are hugely supportive of this process. But again, there's an urgency to be able to address the regulatory environment and the tendency for developed nations to regulate for everybody else. And of course, this is promoted as absolutely necessary in terms of advancing global standards. And, you know, I sometimes wonder, standards absolutely hugely important. Yeah, but if you own the standards, easy to implement. If you don't or haven't been part of their evolution, it's a different story. Also, I'm suggesting launch a scientific equity and gender inclusion index to measure where we stand in participation, data access, and institutional diversity, because what we measure, we can and must change. Science will shape our future, but unless it is open, inclusive, and governed for equity and is equitable, it risks replicating the very injustices we aim to overcome. Let us not build digital barriers in the name of safety. Let us not entrench scientific silos in the name of sovereignty. Let us instead build a science ecosystem that reflects the realities, aspirations, and rights of all, especially women and girls, and especially those in the global south, the global majority. From Pact to Progress is not a slogan. It is a call to redesign the rules of global cooperation with courage, clarity, and commitment. And as I mentioned, we look forward to the General Assembly this September, the 80th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. We have just emerged from the United Nations Financing for Development Summit in Seville a few weeks ago, which gave great pause for thought. Of course, it was a financing meeting. It wasn't a science meeting. However, you will be aware that science is reflected in the conclusions and recommendations. I think this is a hugely important, not just for funding, but in terms of the advancement of the relevance of science to humanity and society more generally. And again, apologies for the Euro bias, but I am a great fan of alignment. And on Wednesday, rather tomorrow, the European Union will publish its multi-annual financial framework, also known as a budget forecast for the next essentially 10 years. And we're very keen to see what that will do for science, but more specifically what it will do for science in a development context. And I think that's worth reflecting on in this environment, in this context. Also, I have reflected a lot on the fact that I would argue that the global science system is predicated on the altar of excellence, and many policymakers bow before that altar, and I think that's in many senses very good. However, I think when you look at it from other perspectives, which I like to do, scientific excellence is a very good definition of exclusion, and this is why we must, and it's urgently required that we reflect on how science works in a broader development context. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Declan, and really, great thoughts on this, regulatory and environment, the need for regulatory frameworks, but make sure that they're equitable and inclusive, and the opportunity for all sectors and all peoples to be involved in moving this forward. Very important. So thank you. And I just think that the theme of rights and human rights came up repeatedly in these conversations. I think that's absolutely critical. So we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. And as I've been looking at the Q&A, and so those of you who have put questions in the chat, please be patient with me as I try to get through some of them. I've been looking at them and coming up in no real particular order. I'll try and get to the questions. And coming off Declan's presentation, I think maybe it's a good question that has been put in by Dr. Ibrahim Yusuf. which I'm not sure where Dr. Yusuf is from, but just a general question on open science in Africa. The question: can open science truly drive innovation and development in Africa? And so, in what ways can it drive? Can open science drive that? And I open the floor. I'm not going to pick on any particular presenter, but and Megs can hopefully help me pick who this should go to or who jumps in first. But please, the floor is open to the amazing presenters here.
Just a brief reaction, maybe not an answer. We are stuck for time, but I think a critical word that we haven't mentioned yet is trust. Trust-enabled systems, and I think that is increasingly important from what I see in Africa as a mechanism. And as I also say many times, trust is a very bad business model for law firms, so it doesn't get the attention it deserves, arguably. So I think Africa can show the way forward, is what I would say.
Robert, if I may add, just can open
Please.
science truly drive innovation and development in Africa? Yes, and I'm a true believer of the concept of networks, international networks. So why don't we use open science in the network platform, or using network methodologies to drive forward that innovation in different regions of the world, like Africa? So we don't put the responsibility of becoming open science just institution by institutions, but rather learning together in a network context, sharing data, sharing best practices, sharing tools. That's why in my presentation I share about Robin initiative, which I think is a great example to other sectors or academic backgrounds and topics and teams that could be pushed forward to bring countries in and drive innovation.
And maybe just to add from the other side before I leave, because I have to leave in 2 minutes, is that when you have an open science network system where you have dominant northern scientists presenting ideas and African or Asian scientists being there, sometimes this creates a problem because the perspectives from the north are then used to mobilize ideas in the global south. So let's say we're talking about market mechanisms that may work well here, or public-private partnerships that may well work here. And then we're trying to transfer those kinds of governance systems to the global south. And of course, it is indigenized, but the problem is that then they are subject to Western laws, for example, the bilateral investment treaties, if it is public-private agreements. And so what happens is that in some ways, they are taken along with the sort of a dominant narrative, and perhaps they need a completely different narrative. Like, why are the poorest countries in the world paying the highest interest rates on loans? Because the financial system says that the risk is higher in a poorer country, and that is because it's from the Western perspective that is done. And then these models are then transferred, or even if they're indigenized in the developing world, they bring risks with them. So I know that Maria made a very passionate plea about not talking about the different groups. I remember that President Nyerere had once said that demolishing the differences between the groups is what is very much in the interest of global north countries, because the politics are so different. And so I understand, I would always call it industrializing country and developing, not developed, because I think that's a problem. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are very, very strong differences also, and not necessarily that one is more hierarchically upper and lower, but that maybe there's a different kind of politics here and we need to deal with that. But I will leave this over here and I will run with your permission. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. And Dr. Gupta did inform us beforehand that she had to leave at 10 a.m. Eastern time here in the U.S. Not sure what time is in everybody else's time zones, but a huge thank you to Dr. Gupta for joining us. The next question I was going to go to is actually referred directly to Dr. Gupta's presentation, but I think all of you, have kind of touched on the human rights issues and how the human rights issues fill it into the, and as we think about it at the UN, the pillars that the UN is based on, peace and security, human rights and sustainable development, and in making sure that we're considering all those when we think about all the work we do here. But Sherry Marie Carr is asking, regarding Dr. Gupta's presentation, how do we incorporate human rights with AI? And I think we've also seen, the madness that is coming out of some AI platforms the last few days, but also the last few months, and how are we making sure that we're getting there with AI and incorporating human rights there. So, floor is open again. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that, please. And maybe Matthew, I mean, I would go to you. I mean, is this being discussed in the intergovernmental conversations around AI and around open science? I mean, incorporating human rights and the challenges with AI that brings?
Thanks so much, Robert. Yes, of course. I think for everyone who was involved in the Pact negotiations last year, the Global Digital Compact as well, I think it was very much a dominant topic of the discussion. The idea that our technology needs to be human-centric. We have to achieve that balance, right, between innovation and protecting the rights of the individual users, but also collectively as societies, right, protecting ourselves from the adverse effects of many of these innovations. So I think it's very much about trying to strike that balance in our societies, and also at the global level. And of course, I mean, those of you who are at the United Nations will know that it's very challenging at times to find a global consensus on human rights. When we had these discussions on the Pact and on the Global Digital Compact, you had many of the developing countries, for example, strongly emphasizing the right to development, which much of the G77 sees as a core human right, and then you also have many of the other individual human rights that are very key and very central that many countries feel very strongly about. So I think at the international level, we have to find this effort to find that global consensus on what are all these rights that we coalesce around, and then individually in our societies, in our own context, each government has to drive this forward, but also in partnership with our stakeholders, with civil society, with societies to build that consensus around it. Because I mean, at the end of the day, that's how you propagate this across society and across the world, right? You need that strong consensus behind saying, okay, these are the rights we need to protect. These are the things that are critical, and this is how we build it out and actually get to the implementation. Because at the end of the day, it's easy at the UN to come up with a declaration and say, these are the rights that are very important, right? And I think we do this a lot with AI, where we say that, AI needs to be fair, AI needs to be non-discriminatory, AI, cannot impact vulnerable populations. It's very easy to declare, but actually, when you get down to building product, when you get down to implementing policy, you then get to a lot of these hard questions and edge cases, right? So yes, you need to be sure what your global consensus is, what your societal consensus is, but then at the end of the day, you then need to get down to the implementation, make sure you have the professionals who have thought about this, who've talked to people, and then figure out how do we actually do this in a way that matters to real people.
Oh, great. Declan or Maria, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would absolutely fully agree and support everything that Matthew has said. Totally, I'm there. But I mean, I have to tell you that following the implementation of the EU AI Act, they never considered any of that. Nothing. Never considered. That's no exaggeration. And now on the statute books of the European Union is this AI Act, which has, if you go to the final page, you'll see it has extraterritorial application. It applies everywhere. So, for example, there was no consultation with what are called less or lesser developed nations, none. So we're working now on a proposal to bring other nations into this process, in particular African nations. And this is again where you see legislators ignoring effectively what the UN is advancing in terms of a global agenda. And I think it's a real issue. It's a real issue. Never mind the inability or the lack of commitment of member states of the United Nations to implement UN measures such as the SDGs into national legislation. That by and large doesn't happen. And now you could argue it doesn't matter with policy measures, but it certainly matters with regulatory issues, which is what we're seeing in the case of AI, the GDPR, and there are many others. So I think that's something we have to be very open-eyed about in terms of how this will impact global cooperation in the future, particularly in Africa and the global south. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll jump to one more question. I think there have been a couple of questions about the private sector and engaging the private sector around this. And near the end of the chat, there's a question from Melissa Allen, which talks about return on investment, which I don't consider return on investment just to be a private sector issue. I mean, because I think all organizations have to demonstrate progress or change and shift. It's not just, so I don't think of it just as financial really, but the question is, how important is it to demonstrate a return on investment, social and economic, which obviously she's included what I just said in the question, when making the case for open science and investing in building those enabling environments, for example, national policy frameworks. And do you have any examples of where evidence impact of ROI has helped drive buy-in? And I think that's, again, cross sectors, and I think it's important. And I think definitely talking about there, it seems like embedded within this, and I'm not an expert like any of you are, there's a question of equity, but then it becomes competitive as well. And how do we balance that?
Robert,
Maria,
I think, yes, thank you. So it's very important to, of course, demonstrate return on investment. And Matthew mentioned about the importance of bringing professionals in order to operationalize open science and human rights. But I would add something else: trust and legitimacy in what we're doing, right? And in order to do that, we need to demonstrate a level of return on investment, which I believe is crucial. It helps us in terms of policy justification for measures. It helps us for stakeholder buy-in, for sustainability. And what better example? That's something that touch upon all of us here in this call, regardless of where we are, if we were based in the UK, in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, in North America. What better example than COVID-19 research response, involving academia, but also private sector. So during the pandemic, we learned about the importance of open sharing of data, protocols, vaccines, and it was quite unprecedented at the global collaboration, from a global collaboration perspective. So being open, being rapidly open, helped accelerated vaccine development and public health responses, and that was essential to build buy-in, build trust, and also I think, in a way, it brought open science forward very fast in the context of a year, to preserve human rights, to preserve humanity, to preserve health, well-being. So yeah, that's the example I would like to bring.
Maybe I'll jump in here as well.
Yeah, please, Matthew. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, Robert. I think this is a very good question, because I think it's a reminder that open science, in a sense, is not costless. That is, it's not something that we declare will happen and then it just happens, right? It's hard, in a way. It's hard to do open science. That if you're talking about open data, it's another step that the scientists have to do, right? You have to make sure that your data is out there, your data is clean, it's accessible. You have to maintain those repositories. If you're talking about sharing of code, it's the same thing, right? The code runs on your machine, that's fine, but actually if you want something that's reproducible or replicable, that's out there, open source, that's a different story. So I think it's good that we acknowledge that, and I think in many ways this is it's a collective action problem, right? There is maybe not so much incentive for any individual researcher to do this, but if you have government leading the way, if you have government putting in place these frameworks across the sector, and everybody recognizes that this is good, I think, and that there are benefits. And if you have government leading the way, providing that baseline, then that gives us the opportunity to pull everyone up to that standard and bring everyone along. And I think it's also a case of making that case, right? As Maria said, you actively make that case. And for example, that COVID-19 case is a very good example of making that case to society, to policymakers. I think also knowing your audience. So talking to researchers, for example, one argument that I think does resonate very strongly for open science is it's about research integrity, and that matters to researchers a lot. Once you open things up, they can be a lot surer that the research that they're seeing is it works, right? That the results that have been gotten are what we say that we've gotten. So I think it's about making that case. It's about bringing people along, and so yes, I think it's very important that we are demonstrating that return on investment. I mean, it doesn't need to be monetary return. Return will matter to different people, but you have to show that this is why we are doing this. This is why that extra work matters.
Yeah,
no, great. Yeah, please, Declan, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, just a very, very interesting discussion. But one thing I took away from, we ran a series of meetings at the World Bank Spring Meeting this year, where there was very little discussion on science. But clearly, the role of capital markets is critical here. But I think we're at the foothills of how that's going to work in future. And I think also we need to be very conscious not to be dichotomous when we talk about public-private sector, because 72% of the global investment in health R&D is from the private sector. And that's a huge reality that we need to be able to understand, and how ROI works in that investment, data sharing works, and open access works there. I think we have to look at much more cohesively. And then when we come to initiatives such as the global public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, we need to understand the role of public-private sectors there, and also the competitive versus the pre-competitive spaces. And I'd argue from a global standpoint, I think these concepts are very mature in the North, but they are not, and they're emerging in the global South. And we need to have a much better aligned conversation, how they work, how the capital markets are going to invest in these spaces, and how the science community that's a generalization, of course, but how it's going to narrate the ROI issue. And that is very, very complex, but I would see opportunities in future in that, particularly in Africa.
No, great. I think at this point, I think we're at time. I want to respect everybody's time. It's 10:15. We said this would run from 9 to 10:15, and I think everyone's running busy schedules these days. I know that for sure. But I actually think that was a good question and answer to end on, because it demonstrates the complexities, but the opportunities if you can bring the markets together, with government together, science and academia, and across the board civil society, and just the general population to look at this and think about how we can advance with open science and really drive the change we need and get to the answers we need to drive the SDG agenda to achieve as much as we can by 2030, which is absolutely critical. And with a high-level political forum going the next couple of weeks here, looking toward to September in the General Assembly, as Declan referred to a couple of times, I think it's important that we're consistently thinking about this. And I guess I would end with a comment that is in the chat from El Taqwa University in Afghanistan, that just indicated developing countries must be the core agenda for the upcoming United Nations Open Science Conference. I think that's absolutely essential. And I would ask everyone that's joining us here today, and all of your colleagues that maybe weren't able to join us, to be thinking about that and helping us make sure that we drive that agenda, so that is absolutely inclusive and reaching all the folks we need to find solutions together here on this. So with that, again, Declan, Maria, Matthew, and of course Joyeeta for joining us and offering such insightful conversation here. Thanks to everyone else for joining us and being part of this. No matter what time it is where you are, absolutely appreciative, and from the Declan Marshall Library and all of us at the United Nations, thank you so much for being a part of this absolutely critical conversation, and have a great rest of the day or evening wherever you are.